Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started. It looks like it's 5 o'clock. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the People's Review Live, hosted by the Equality State Policy Center. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization advocating for fair elections and transparent government for all of Wyoming's communities. My name is Marissa Carpio. I'm the new policy director at ESPC, and I will be moderating tonight. Since 2020, ESPC has been virtually hosting the People's Review Live with the goal of bringing pressing issues and subject experts to Wyoming's people. Free of cost and highly accessible, PR Live falls right in line with our mission. PR Live is possible thanks to the generous support of our People's Review Live Leadership Circle members. If you'd like to know how to become a Leadership Circle member, please email info@equalitystate.org. As a reminder, this meeting is in webinar format, so the panelists can see and hear each other, but they cannot see or hear you. Although the panelists can't see you, we do encourage you to put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A feature anytime during our conversation. If you can't see or hear the panelists right now or have any technical issues during the event, please shoot us a message. It should just say hosts and panelists. We'll help you as best as we can. So thank you all again for being with us tonight. We have a great set of experienced speakers with backgrounds in journalism, candidacy, and state agencies, and I have the privilege to introduce them. So I will go ahead and do that. First, we have Karen Wheeler. Karen began her 37-year career with the Secretary of State's office in 1985 and has had the honor of working for 7 secretaries of state, including Wyoming's only 3 female secretaries of state. Karen concluded her career with the Secretary of State's office, serving as the Wyoming Deputy Secretary for the last 7 years. As the Deputy Secretary of State, Karen was responsible for all statutory duties and operations of the Secretary of State's office. This included strategic planning, policy, legislative testimony, budget, personnel, staff development, and oversight of service to the public. Karen was born and raised in Cheyenne and is a proud graduate of the University of Wyoming. In her free time, she enjoys spending her time with her husband, children, and grandchildren. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you.
So next we have Lynnette Grable. Lynnette Grable has been an active advocate for Indian country for over 10 years. She's the founder and director of Not Our Native Daughters, an organization that focuses on the work and education of human trafficking in the missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls. Lynnette serves on the Wyoming Governor's Task Force for Missing Murdered Indigenous Persons, to which she proposed Wyoming Governor Gordon to create and implement, and the Wyoming Human Trafficking Task Force. Ms. Grable also advocates for the diversity and inclusion of Native Americans, Indigenous preservation of land and water rights, child protection, cultural and traditional competency, environmental justice, and voting rights. She was the first Native American to run for federal office in the state of Wyoming, and she strives for a future where Native Americans prevail in all of the same areas where other ethnicities succeed. It's great to have you, Lynnette.
Thank you for having me.
And last, but certainly not least, we have Maggie Mullen. Maggie reports on state government and politics for WyoFile, an independent nonprofit news service. Born, raised, and educated in Wyoming, Maggie's commitment to public interest journalism has kept her close to home. She cut her reporting teeth at Wyoming Public Radio and was a founding member of the Mountain West News Bureau, a collaboration between public media newsrooms across the region. She currently lives in Sheridan. So there's no way I could do them justice by just reading their bios. So I'd love if we could all go around and say a little bit more about your organization or what got you interested in Wyoming policy. And Karen, we'll start with you.
Thank you very much, Marissa. And I do believe my screen has frozen, and this is the joy of living out in the country. So at least I don't have one eye open and one eye closed. So I will let you know that, yes, I was in the Secretary of State's office for 37 years, and it was 37 incredible years. I've had the opportunity to meet so many different elected officials, constituents from across the state. And what really got me interested in policy and working for an elected was probably one of the greatest mentors that I could have ever had, which was my mother. My mother served as United States Senator Al Simpson State Director, and for a while, Senator Enzi State Director until my father became ill. But I learned from her the joys, the triumphs, the failures in politics, but really how you can go about affecting change and really affecting change for the positive for our state. And having been born and raised here, this is my home. I want to see my state survive and be successful. And so really it was my mother and what she did that got me interested. But then, as you mentioned, I had the incredible honor of working for Wyoming's only 3 female secretaries of state. And they were incredible, strong women, 2 Republicans, 1 Democrat. Party didn't matter to them. They were wonderful leaders. They led by policy that was, again, what was right for our state, not driven by their respective parties, not driven by the national soundbite of the month, but really what was best for our state. So they were incredibly inspiring. So between those 3 female secretaries of state and my mother, this just really, it was one of those that just felt right. You felt at home doing what I did. And again, what an incredible opportunity I had for 37 years.
Thank you so much. I think that was great insight, and I didn't know that was your mother, and that's fantastic history there. Lynnette, if you don't mind going next.
Yes. Well, thank you again for having me. It's always an honor to share a panel with some other amazing women leadership. So thank you also to the fellow panelists that is with me tonight. My name is Lynnette Grable. I'm the director for Not Our Native Daughters. I started Not Our Native Daughters back in 2014. I used to work many years in the anti-human trafficking network across the nation. And one of the things that I've learned during that work, when I was working for other nonprofits, was that there was no nonprofits that were out there that were advocating specifically for Native American victims. So that's what compelled me to start my organization. I'm also a survivor of sexual assault and rape and domestic violence. So that also, my life experiences and some of the things that I was able to overcome has also compelled me to advocate for all women, not only for the protection part of violence and sexual assault and domestic violence and things of that nature, but I also believe in women leadership and that we should be supportive of one another. I think that's really important here in Wyoming, specifically because we still have yet to make some strides in certain areas, especially in the realms of policy. If you would ask me 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, maybe that if I would ever run for, House or run for an office, I probably would have told you no. But I think that's something when you're striving for change and you're striving for equality, when you're striving to make a difference in your community or collective communities across the state, it kind of drives you in that place to create some type of change in the realm of policy, both on a state and federal level. And so that kind of focus and the dreams that I have for change compelled me to run for policy or run for office, and make some effective change into the work of policy. So that's what made me, get involved more in political and policy work and also lobby. And I've lobbied on some federal and state bills, both here locally in the state of Wyoming, but also in federal legislation. And I think it's important that, that there be people like myself and people like others who voice those elements of change that we need in our communities, in our state. So I'm a big advocate for that. But that's just a little snippet of what I do. I wear many hats, being an advocate for Indian country and of course, specifically for Wind River, something I'm very passionate about. And I find myself being more of a bridge maker here. I think that a lot of our collective communities, because we're all rural region, we're a lot alike, and we have a lot of things that we share across the state of Wyoming. So I like to build those bridges of commonplace because, you know, for us at Wind River and collective communities across the state, we're very much alike. And I'd like to see us find more areas that we can create change together. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And I totally agree with your sentiment about everybody using their voices. It's so important in our state. Maggie?
Yeah, thank you so much, Marissa, for having me. It's great to be here. You know, I really admire the work that Equality State Policy Center provides to Wyoming, but I really got interested, or I guess more interested in policy when I started working for WyoFile about 1.5 years ago at this point. As you mentioned, I was a public radio reporter for about 5 years, and didn't ever really set out to be a journalist, but was a graduate student at UW, and you know, I kind of had a vague interest in public radio and knew other folks that had done internships at the radio station, and that's how I started. And Bob Beck, former news director there, and several other really great reporters and editors just took me under their wing, and kind of like a condensed version of journalism school, but the journalism bug bit, and did a little bit of legislative reporting while I was at WPR. Got the chance to go over to Cheyenne when the legislature was meeting in the old Jonah building, which was a former Kmart. And so I feel like I got to see the legislature at my first, you know, experience with it was at a very unique time for the body. But when I was hired at WyoFile, you know, I officially stepped into this state government and politics beat. And, you know, one thing that has really stunned me about this particular kind of reporting is one is the kind of access that reporters have to decision makers in Wyoming. I do think that is unique to a state of our size. And, you know, that coupled with the fact that, you know, unfortunately, the press corps in Wyoming over the last decade or so has gotten a lot smaller for a variety of reasons. And so it's not unusual for there to be only, you know, one member of the press in any given, you know, governmental meeting. So the work feels really meaningful to me, and it's almost always interesting too.
Thanks, Maggie. I feel like we have a good spread of perspectives here. So that kind of leads me into my first question, which is, why is women's representation in policy so important for the success of our state? And you can think that through any framework, or answer that question in any framework, whether that's state government, your organization, and journalism, whatever really speaks to you. And we'll start with Karen, and then go Lynnette, and then Maggie.
Thank you, Marissa. Well, of course, we are very important as far as representation in state policy, because we represent half the population in our state, but yet we are not represented equally in policy-making decisions. And so I think having women's representation in policy is incredibly important, because we bring a different background. We bring a more, I'm going to say, diverse perspective than a lot of our male counterparts. And each and every one of us on this panel has a different background and a different perspective that we can bring to the table. As I was thinking back over my 37 years, which some days felt like 150 years, but thinking of a lot of the policy decisions, sitting around the table for hours upon hours. As a working mother, I realized as I was sitting there that I was a great peacekeeper. I had to do that at home, and you could do it very well in these types of discussions. I had strong negotiating skills, although I didn't have to ground anybody and take their phone away, but I was able to negotiate and we could come to resolution. But also, you find the art of compromise so that whatever resolution we came to, everyone felt like it was a success. Did everyone win? No, but everyone was happy with it. So I think that, again, it's important because we are underrepresented when it comes to policy, but we bring so many different backgrounds and life experiences that can help shape policy in a different and yet very successful way.
I think women leadership is important overall, but here for our state here in Wyoming, I think representation is a huge vital key of leadership. But also, I would also say for diversity and inclusion, I think women leadership represents diversity and inclusion, not just because we're women leadership, but also to speak to the different ethnicities and different things that we bring in perspective, background, experiences. I have not met any woman leader, whether it's in their place of employment, whether it's in their community or within the state, and in all these different sectors that hadn't experienced some type of rough patch or times where they had to overcome certain things because they were a woman leader, and or coming along the trail of becoming a woman leader. I think that our voice is important. I think that we bring a different perspective to the table. And I think that it's important for other young women and our own daughters. I have a daughter, to see that women leadership is important, and not only in our community, but within our state. I think that once we break ground and trailblaze these certain areas, that we will begin to see other women coming out of areas that we need women leadership and women voices in. So role modeling is important, representation, diversity and inclusion, and then also just addressing gender inequality. That is also very important. Women continue to face gender disparities in various aspects of life, including in politics and leadership. By promoting women leadership in rural areas, such as our state, we can make a growing difference, not only in the realm of the different areas that we all work in, but also in economic development that especially our state needs.
I think I'll speak to this also within, I guess the framework of government. The democratic process requires, the participation of all citizens. And, like Karen mentioned, women account for, roughly half of the state's population. And, what makes a democracy truly representative is, when everyone has a seat at the table, everyone's voice is included. And, of course, that's not just, gender representation that, really spans all kinds of identities, but, again, women's political inclusion or representation, however you want to phrase it, that inclusion in decision making, I think is, a democratic good in and of itself. And, thinking more specifically in terms of our state, Wyoming is a citizen legislature, meaning that, the members who are elected, they serve part-time, and that service to our state, is almost never their primary occupation. It's certainly not their primary source of income. I feel pretty confident saying that. But, in more recent years, some lawmakers have pointed out that, representation at the state house has been, a little bit heavy on retirees, those that are self-employed, also men. And they point to the fact that, serving in a citizen legislature, it requires someone to be in a position to step away from their lives, to step away from their obligations, their families, their jobs, in exchange for pretty limited compensation. And, that unfortunately, in the eyes of a lot of lawmakers, that has made it harder for, say, someone who does the majority of household work or does the majority of childcare, which is, traditionally or very frequently women, I should say. But again, I'd say the democratic process really requires the participation of everyone. So that's definitely a challenge we have here in Wyoming.
Yeah, thank you. Those are great answers. I definitely agree that having a chair at the table is part of the democratic process, and we need women to be representative of our state. So thank you again. And Lynnette, I kind of want to go back to something that you mentioned about some of the obstacles that women face just being in policy or around policy. So not in any order, whoever wants to go first, what unique obstacles have you faced in your line of work or in policy as a woman? And then when facing those obstacles, what motivates you to keep pushing? Because you all are women leaders and you probably have encountered obstacles before. So if you just don't mind sharing that story and what got you past it.
Yeah, I don't mind going first. Well, there's two things I can remember. One, the first one, running for office as a Native American woman, not being taken seriously. And the second thing that I remember is lobbying on certain bills in the state legislature, and having to, pull out different representatives, speak to the issues that I was lobbying on. And in both of those issues, I've experienced people not taking me seriously. And whether it was because I was a woman, or maybe it was because I was Native American, not quite sure. But, I remember feeling the being discriminative towards, because I was speaking to an issue that was important, not only to myself, but to my Wind River community. And I think it was beneficial for the entire state on some of these bills that I was lobbying on and speaking to. And when I lobby, I speak to both sides of the aisle. I try to find common ground, speak to the issue, bring facts, bring statistics, to, highlight what I'm trying to lobby for and why is it important. And I have been successful in some of those conversations, with some representatives that understand and was able to see, where I was coming from. But there was others that, again, just not taking me seriously, not giving me their full attention. So, I hate to blanket everyone and say, or all people are like this, and that's definitely not the case. But I just remember feeling the feeling of being not taken seriously. I think it's important that when we're trying to build community, in any type of topic, whether it's on a community level or a state level, that everybody has an equal part to say how they feel, what they experience, why they want to see this change, whether they're a leader or not, or just a regular old community member. I think we all have an equal part to play in this. And I really wish more people in Wyoming, specifically in Wyoming, would come out and speak to the issues that we want to see change. A lot of us have an idea of what we want to be as a community. What do we want to see as a state? Things like tourism, things like economic development, things, all these different array of things that makes up our community. And it takes a collective voice to create the type of community and state that we want. And I think that it's important that no matter who it is, and I always encourage youth to come out, and speak to policy changes and things that affect our community, because I think that it's so important that every person and every community member and every Wyomingite has a seat at the table, but also has a voice. So I get empowered when I am kind of downplayed, when I feel like I am not taken seriously, because then I just want to fight even more and bring that voice even more to the forefront, whether it's coming to media, whether it's coming to other outlets to bring that voice. But I think that we all should have a collective space where we can bring our concerns, and try to make those differences that we want to see.
I think Lynnette has nailed it on the head in several areas. And she mentioned, not being taken seriously. And I can tell you, this is what I find so heartbreaking about this, is I've been around a really long time. And I wasn't taken seriously in the beginning. And that is something that sadly has not changed. And prior to being the Deputy Secretary of State, a lot of the previous roles that I had were always male roles. They didn't have women that did those functions or jobs previously. So I had to break through that glass ceiling, so to speak. And I had to work incredibly hard to prove that I was an equal. I could do what my predecessors did, and you know what? I could do it better. And I made sure that I proved myself with facts. I was very solid. I always took the high road. You have to take the high road, which is sometimes not always the road that's most traveled. But I found that as a woman that you have to present differently. So I testified before legislative committees for probably 20 of my 37 years. Now, if I would push back on a bill, I would be chastised for doing so. And in my 20 plus years, I was once chastised for pushing back. And I did it in a very, very professional way. And I did it with facts. However, sadly, if a male did the same thing, because after that I watched, I wanted to make sure that I wasn't out of line. But when men did it, it was okay. They might have been cautioned, but typically it went unnoticed. So I think as women, we do have to work a little bit harder to be taken seriously. And as far as when I hit these obstacles, what motivated me? Stubbornness. I was going to prove them wrong. You know, I can do just what anybody else did. And again, you know, kind of going along with what Lynnette said, you do it for your community, you do it for your state. What you want to do is to bring about success, bring about change. And so we continue to do it. And that's why we continue to work hard. And if we have to work harder to prove ourselves, then we do it. And it is so that we can be impactful for our state and our community.
I would totally reiterate, you know, lots of things that Karen and Lynnette said. You know, I feel like I've definitely experienced, you know, being at the legislature. It is sort of interesting because right now the majority of the reporters that are covering the legislature are women, which is very cool. And also, you know, bucks this national trend. I think it was earlier this year, I saw the Pew Research Center had done this journalist survey, and they'd found that, you know, men are more likely to cover politics. And I thought it was so cool that here in Wyoming, we have such a woman-dominated press corps at the Capitol. But, you know, obviously, most of the folks that I interact with when I'm at the Capitol are men. And I think, you know, to reiterate some of the things that Lynnette and Karen shared, there are challenges being in that environment. I certainly have felt like I wasn't being taken very seriously. And, you know, I guess one other thing I would mention that I think has been a sort of obstacle in my job has been, you know, I think that some of the hostility that we've seen sort of increasing in recent years at the Capitol and in Wyoming politics is, I think that's an obstacle for anyone working in state government and politics, you know, sort of regardless of gender. I think it's, you know, simply hard to get work done in that kind of environment, whether you're a legislator trying to get a bill passed, or, you know, you're a journalist trying to ask questions of, you know, someone who is pretty dead set on having an antagonistic relationship with the press. But I also, I was so delighted to hear Karen, you know, mention stubbornness, because, you know, when I was sort of thinking about this, I was like, oh, is that the right word choice that I want to use? But I think it absolutely is. I think that's, you know, I think folks in Wyoming are especially stubborn, and I think that can serve us well often. I mean, I guess one thing that comes to mind that I find incredibly motivating was earlier this year, there was a political event, and an elected official stood up at this event and, you know, read a list of names of former Wyoming journalists, you know, that have come here and for a reporting job and eventually left the state. And the implication, as I understood it, was, you know, that these journalists had been ran out of town, you know, when in truth, I think, you know, it had more to do with the fact that Wyoming is a kind of springboard for journalists, and it's not unusual for them to come here fresh out of college and spend a few years getting valuable experience, and then they move on. But the idea that someone in power is sort of rooting against you and hoping that you'll throw in the towel is incredibly motivating to me. And I do sort of feel like I'm in a uniquely good position to be a journalist in Wyoming for a long time, because my family's here and my roots are here. And that's often, unfortunately, what draws a lot of journalists out of the state. So thanks for that question.
Yes, thank you all. I think I have been one who has also been called stubborn in my life, so I also appreciate that. It looks like we just got a question through the Q&A feature, which kind of aligns with the question that I was planning to ask. So I'm going to try to morph them a little bit. There are some policy decisions that we've seen come through the legislature. One specifically that comes to mind for me is the recurrent budget amendment that attempts to defund the Gender and Women's Studies program at UW. There are a lot of other examples, but these policy decisions are often perceived as against women's interests. However, they're often supported by women legislators. And one of the audience members said that more seats in the legislature are being held by women today than of recent years, but most of that seems to be women that are maybe a little bit more extreme. So I guess, why do you think that that is happening? And can you speak to what that means for women's equity in Wyoming? And we'll start again with Karen and then Lynnette and Maggie.
So as far as the political affiliation of those that are certainly in the legislature right now, I think it's a little bit of a wave that we saw over the last few elections. While it is great to see more women legislators, I think what we're seeing is really part of a wave. As far as, and I did think about this when it happened, voting against certain bills. My personal belief, and this is just my belief, is that when they make those votes, it comes down to their personal beliefs, but also what they think their constituents want them to do. And again, it's because of my 37 years. While I appreciate that, I think you have to go back and vote as to what is best for your state as a whole. And granted, a legislator is elected by a certain district in their community, but they also need to think of the state as a whole and vote as to what would be best for our state as a whole.
I have to echo what Karen has said. It's a very important task when you're elected into office. And, we've seen the political realm and, in the last, 5-6 years, people are some, not all, but some elected officials or offices, representatives, they're voting what they feel like their party make a stance on. And I think that's dangerous to do for both sides. I'm not calling one side out. I'm calling this is crucial for both sides, because that's dangerous to do for any political aspect in any political realm, because then you take the people and what the community needs are out of policy. It becomes a you versus them type of mentality that is also very detrimental to the country and to the state and to collective communities. I think it's very important to understand what your community needs are, what your constituents' needs are. And you're elected in that office to speak for, a region or communities or even a state. And I think it's important that you understand thoroughly what both party affiliations, whether, their side or that side, what the needs are for the community, for children, for women, what's going to promote community well-being. And when it comes to, I always find this laughable, but, we're known as the equality state because we had women leadership in our historical background in the state of Wyoming. And there's been some elected officials, and I'm not here to call out any names, who voted against women's studies, women's things that would honor women and women leadership in politics. There's women who've been elected in these different offices that vote against these types of bills that promote women leadership, honoring past women who've made it into leadership in politics. And I just kind of scratch my head on that, because I'm thinking, you're coming from you represent either a state or you represent, some a district in Wyoming that we are known for this. We are known for having women leadership in politics. I think it was very important for anybody who serves in Wyoming, especially as a woman leader, to understand not the historical background of Wyoming, but also to carry that torch forward. So continue to promote women leadership, continue to promote women's studies, things that help us along the pathway of women leadership. And like I said, I find it laughable when I see elected officials vote against it, especially when it's women representatives. I think that we have a hard hill to climb as in women leadership, and other women leaders shouldn't make it that much harder.
So I guess I'll start with the specifics, sort of recalling back to some of those debates with the Gender and Women's Studies program. The lawmakers that brought those amendments and were in support of them. So at least one of the arguments, that they were making was that, they had the impression that voters, or they had even heard from constituents that, they're not interested in, seeing their tax dollars fund such a program. So that was at least what was said on the floor. But I think, dissecting why women would or would not support any one policy is such a good reminder of, that women aren't necessarily a voting bloc, and they certainly aren't in the Wyoming legislature. And, women, they're not this monolith, but are actually, shaped by their personal interests and their life experience. So of course, they bring different ideological perspectives to bear on their work. And, in Wyoming, we happen to see that particular kind of splintering out, very clearly in this debate about how much the legislature should determine what is taught at the University of Wyoming. It also, funnily enough, it reminds me of a few years ago when a couple of former lawmakers, Representative Kathy Connolly, a Democrat, and Representative Marty Halverson, a Republican, they teamed up to support this bill to study the gender wage gap. And it wasn't even because the two of them both agreed that it even existed. The two of them just agreed that a study, needed to take place. But they teamed up and they got the bill passed. But it's just sort of interesting to think back on, that's an example of two women that were serving in the state house that, had very different sort of political leanings, but, were able to, sort of find a patch of common ground.
Yeah, thank you all for that. I guess I'll use that as a great segue. ESBC has helped fund the gender wage gap for 2022. There are a lot of policy recommendations within that wage gap report to get to close that wage gap. One of those being childcare and other types of policy reform that can bring women closer to the men's pay grade, but I also think can bring women into policy because they have more time if they're not on childcare. So if you could snap your fingers and implement one policy change to help women in Wyoming, what would it be? And it could be as specific and as general as you want it, or if you don't have one that you think in the future, think of one that has already been passed or maybe already has failed that you want to bring up again. And maybe whoever wants to go first for this one.
I can jump in. I appreciate the question because it gives me a chance to, remind folks that, to remind them of the importance of, the press be independent and that, reporters, not weigh in personally on, any one bill or policy. That said, I do think it is a good sign of a functioning government when you see, lawmakers like the example I just gave with Kathy Connolly and Marty Halverson, when you see them, come together and get creative and sort of work together to get legislation passed. So anytime that happens, that's always very interesting to me as a journalist. And also, like I said, I think is, it's a good sign of a functioning government.
The one thing that first came to mind was the wage equity issue. And it's always been an issue. We're making progress. We're making good progress, but I think it still needs to be addressed. And I loved what Maggie talked about, because Kathy Connolly and Marty Halverson, two incredibly strong, powerful women on opposite sides of the aisle, but to come together and work together for impactful change. And I just think that is so important. It's such a great example, but I still think, there's a lot of areas that we need to continue to move forward on for women, but definitely the disparity in the wages that we have out there needs to continue to be addressed.
There's actually an array of different policies that I would love to kind of help implement in our state. But I guess if I had to kind of zero in on one, there are several conservation policies that are important in Wyoming. One of the key policies in the protection and management of the state's rural natural resources, and that includes wildlife, land, and water. Wyoming has a rich biodiversity and is a home to numerous species of plants and animals, some of which are unique to the region here. Conservation policies aim to preserve and restore these ecosystems. And I'm also a big advocate for the Red Desert. We've seen a lot of talk with the governor and other people in places of a legislator that I've talked to and others have talked to about, protection of the Red Desert, especially when it comes to the oil fracking industry that wants to implement on public lands. So if I had to introduce or back up or lobby any bills in our state, it would be around our not only our public lands, but also our conservation, the protection of our wildlife, the protection of our land and water, specifically for us here too at Wind River. There's a lot of controversy around our water. We had, the Bighorn case several years ago. Concerning our water, anybody who's ever worked in conservation understands that conservation is going to be a gold mine, especially as we, in the near future. So I think it's important that we not only protect our land, but also our water. We have the Dinwiddie Glacier here in the state of Wyoming. A lot of other states or even reservations do not have a glacier. And I think these are the type of conversations that is very important for us here, not only for Wind River community, but also for the state of Wyoming. We have a gold mine here in our water and our water systems. We feed other water to other states. I think we need to take a closer look on that, especially, like I said, we think about 10, 20, or even 40 years from now, and the conservation of water and what does that look like. I think we need to have more important conversations about our water protection and how we allot that to other neighboring states.
Great, thank you. The thing that I always say is that all policies affect women, sometimes disproportionately. So I think it's a good thing to keep in mind. One of the things I wanted to say again is that we do have that Q&A feature. So audience members, if you have any questions, please feel free to put those in that feature or through the chat. I guess I'll ask, what is something that you hope that attendees or somebody who's watching this YouTube back, what do you hope that they take away from this conversation? And we'll go Karen, Lynnette, and then Maggie.
Thank you, Marissa. Well, I hope those that are watching and those that watch it in the future can see that we do in Wyoming have a rich history of women who are trailblazers, strong women. I, mentioned the three secretaries of state I worked for, Thyra Thompson, Kathy Carpio, and Diana Oman. Lynnette is a trailblazer. She's accomplished great things as well. And so we've got trailblazers here. Women can do it. We just need women to step up to do it. And in order to do that, reach out to women who are policymakers, who have been policymakers, and let us help you become engaged. Let us help you navigate that tricky little trail that there is to becoming a female leader in the state. And so I just hope that people realize we have some incredible women out there who have already started to plow that trail for you, and you can continue to do it as well, and to lean on those that have done it and have experience.
Yeah, I agree totally. Wyoming is a rural state. And I think that's unique in itself. I think that we have such a gold mine here in Wyoming. We have a great tourism industry here. You can go any part of the state and find a beautiful river, lake, any place of landscape around here. And I think that is very important. But I say that because because we're rural and because we're known as a rural state, the women in leadership in this state, we are fierce. Not only are we trailblazers, but we're fierce. And I encourage others, young women specifically, don't be scared to put yourself out there. Any type of leadership, you're putting yourself out there. And it can be kind of daunting in a rural state because, some of these areas are dominated by men, but we need more women leadership. We need more women voices at the seat at the table to speak to the various issues that we face. I think that it's important that we share our experiences, like Karen has stated. I work with Native youth, and that's something that I always express to them. I empower them to either get into policy or get into these other realms of employment or work and things of that nature, because I think it's important, and I think this is true for all leadership. I think you have a responsibility and an obligation as a leader to help bring the next generation of leadership behind you. I think not only sharing your experiences, not only sharing, the things that you face, maybe hurdles that you've coming over, but we need to make it easier for them to come up as well. And whether it's advice, and again, I kind of echo what Karen says, don't be scared to reach out to other leadership in the state, other leadership, women of leadership in your community, and ask for advice or ask for any type of feedback, because I know myself, and I'm sure others are happy to give it. We're honored to give that information out. And again, I just think it's an obligation and duty to kind of share that information so that we can promote that type of women leadership within our state.
I just wanted to quickly, I guess, share an anecdote, related to something that both Lynnette and Karen said about, reaching out to those that are already engaged, that are already in leadership, that have already kind of gotten the wheels turning. And, I think back to some of the first days that I spent at the Capitol, just trying to figure out the process and, kind of feeling like it was just baptism by fire. And I was also so encouraged by just the number of women that I was able to go to at the Capitol, including lawmakers and lobbyists and staff, et cetera, that were just very helpful and didn't make me feel silly for asking these very basic questions about process. So, I think that I can sort of, back up, what Karen and Lynnette said about, reaching out to women that are already in the mix. But I also, as a journalist, I feel obligated to say that I would ask, folks to support local journalism. I think that's there's some really, really strong and smart women reporters in the state, and they're doing a lot of great work. And reading their work, I know would mean a lot to them. And anytime you can support that part of our democracy, I think it's worth doing.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience. So it says, there is a lot of conversation these days about economic transition, but it seems like a lot of the new businesses we are trying to attract are still industries that will perpetuate the wage gap and other issues. How can we better create economic development that is women focused? So I will open that up to whoever wants to answer first. kind of a heavy question for that. The first thing that comes to my mind is definitely focusing on childcare at a local level, making sure those businesses have those in mind. But Maggie, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I mean, I was just gonna, sort of to your point about childcare, just sort of point to some of the discussion that has happened at the Capitol, as far as, that being a pretty significant piece of the puzzle, is making it easier for women or caretakers to, step outside of those roles. From what I understand, the research and the data really point to that being pretty significantly important.
Definitely.
I know some of this was kind of mentioned earlier, but when we talk about economic development here in the state of Wyoming, we still have a long ways to go. I think that's an important question because we need women at these conversations of economic development. I think economic development moving forward for the state is very important for the growth of our state. I mean, the state of Wyoming sits about 548,000 people within our state. And one thing I always hear when it comes to those who are in college and seeking higher education, some that do graduate, they tend to leave the state. And that's something that I think we need to think about collectively, especially those who are elected into offices. How do we keep our youth within our state? I think that is a great role for women leadership to step into and have those discussions, because, I'm glad that we have our children and our neighbors and our family members who stay here and go to college and seek higher education. But we also have to think about, how do we keep them here? We want them to grow this state, and economic development, keeping our youth here, having jobs available for them, growing different economy structures and different business efforts across the state. And one thing I always say, and I say this to people who don't live in Wyoming, I said, you can come to Wyoming, into any community, and start a business and be successful, because the need is so great. It could be restaurants, it could be food trucks, it could be a variety of different things. But I think we need to start having more conversations on, how do we keep our youth here within our state, so they're not leaving our state, and how women leadership can be involved in that conversation. I think that's a great role for us to try to elevate and try to expound on.
I think Maggie and Lynnette have hit on some really great points. So in the Secretary of State's office, that's where all businesses are registered, corporations, LLCs, all of that. And I can tell you, over the years, we've looked at what can we do to encourage new businesses, economic development in our state, and to keep our youth here, to keep our families here. And it's really hard, because I think in a lot of the communities, you don't have the amenities that your families and your youth are looking for. We are still, and while we have our traditional industry that has supported our state and has been incredible to our state for so long, it's been hard trying to find ways to promote economic development a little bit away from the traditional, so that we can diversify somewhat, which I think with certain diversification in certain industries, those will tend to lean more towards women-owned businesses that will encourage families to move here and to keep the families and the youth here. But that is a tough question, because I can tell you, we struggled with it a lot and reached out to different federal organizations. Our Wyoming Business Council has done an incredible job, but it's a tough question that I think our state as a whole struggles to answer.
Definitely. I think we're going to move to our last question. I think it's been a great conversation. I'll give you each about a minute to think about the following question before we close out. How do we get other women, especially young and women from diverse backgrounds, involved in policy? And we're actually going to go backwards this time. So we'll go Maggie, Lynnette, Karen.
Well, I guess I'll tell you what how I think about doing that as a journalist. And I think that comes down to meeting readers or voters, where they're at, right? So not necessarily coming to them with a story, but going directly to them and asking them, about their lived experience. And then from there, drawing this really clear connection between their everyday lives and policy. I think that's kind of what can get just the first foot in the door, especially for younger people that, for whatever reason, just may not be engaged with the political process. I think it's pretty important to come to them, instead of expecting them to really come to you. And, that to that end, I think part of that also includes, demystifying something like the legislative process. I try to think about that a lot in my reporting, and I do think that is just one of several steps that need to happen, to get other women, especially younger women, those of underrepresented backgrounds, more into the mix.
What we face here in Wyoming, and it's been definitely been my experience, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, is underrepresentation for women leadership and underrepresentation from the Wind River community. If anybody is, in a perfect world, I would say that if you see someone who's trying to run for House district or, county clerk, or, all the different offices that we have throughout the state, and it's a woman that is running for these elected offices, get behind them. When someone is running for office, especially a woman, nobody should have to beg for support. And it could be as simple as giving advice. It could be something as simple as reaching out to the campaign, finding ways to volunteer and help. It's kind of difficult for some of the offices, especially a House representative, to run for office because the communities are so vast and far between. But it's important that, we come together. I really do believe this, and I do live by this, but I do feel like true leadership are those who have the ability to unite. It's important that we unite not only your community and your state, but also unite as women leaders, especially here in Wyoming, because we're so rural and we have yet a long road to go ahead of us. So I say support is a huge one. I say that get behind women who run for office, get behind them, whether, whatever different aspects you want to get behind them, whether it's, funding them, whether it's advice, whether it's giving them words of encouragement, things of that nature. But other states have this, and I know this is something that Wyoming does not have. Other states have different organizations and different coalitions to help promote women leadership and policy. Especially there's other groups out there too that does women leadership, Native women leadership and policy. I think we need something like that here in Wyoming, a coalition or something that women who are seeking to get in the political aspect of things in our state have somewhere to go to, whether it's just getting advice, whether it's training, whether it's learning the political system, legislation, the process of legislation. I think these are all empowering tools to help other emerging women leaders in our state.
Those are great talking points. Those are absolutely wonderful. I wish Wyoming did have that type of an organization where we could get behind and empower women who wish to run for positions. I also am thinking about how to encourage our young people to get into policymaking, whether it's running for office or in another form. We've always thought in our discussions amongst myself and my friends, we need to start when they're young. We need to, if there are organizations in high school where there are young leaders, young women leaders who we could sit down with, we could work with them. Some of the greatest highlights over my years in the secretary's office was when Girls State would come to our office. And these young women were so inspiring, and just hearing about what they learned throughout their week of the three branches of government, the legislative, executive, and judicial, how they had mock sessions, whether it was mock trials or mock legislative sessions. You had your top 5 elected officials amongst the group. They're beginning at that age and in that organization to see that they can affect change. And so many times I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could continue to either be involved at the beginning or during Girl State or even after, to continue to nurture their passion that they have for issues, or to be a female leader in our state in one capacity or another. So I think if we were to get involved, whether it's in high school, Girl State, or organizations like that, to help inspire our young women who will turn into incredible leaders in the future.
Perfect answers. I think it's very important to get women involved at a young age. So thank you all so much for coming. It looks like we're nearing 6 o'clock. Thanks for joining People's Review Live. The Equality State Policy Center is a 501c3 nonpartisan nonprofit organization. We rely on charitable gifts to fund our work, and donations can be made at equalitystate.org. Thank you again, panelists. This was such a great conversation, and I hope you all have a great night.
Thanks, Marissa.
Thank you.